What's going on, Muscle Monsters? Alain Gonzalez here, and welcome to another episode of Muscle Masterminds, where we take an expert in the field and delve deep into one very specific topic. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about periodization for building muscle. Today, we are joined by Tom, who's a former skinny kid who was told he was too small to make it as a rugby player, and since then has added over 40 pounds to his frame. He's helped hundreds of guys build muscle and drop fat, and more recently he founded Flat White's Free Weights to provide a hub for his online clients and to share his thoughts on training, nutrition, and the ultimate pre-workout supplement, coffee. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Hey man, no, you're welcome. Great. Thanks very much for having me on.
For sure. So some of you guys may recognize Tom from the periodization series that he did for my channel not too long ago. But I kind of want to delve a bit deeper, ask some more specific questions, and hopefully by the end of this interview, you guys will have a better idea on how to create your own muscle building program. And again, this is going to be specifically for guys who want to build muscle. So first things first, Tom, can you kind of just go over what periodization is and why it's important when we want to build muscle?
Yeah, sure. The first thing to think is you just need a plan. Any plan is better than no plan. And periodization is essentially the plan manipulation of training variables to maximize the adaptation. A lot of people get really kind of scared by periodization. I think it's a really complex subject. It's really not that complex, and most people probably do some sort of periodization without realizing, because they, do sets of 8 on Monday and they're doing sets of 12 on Thursday. That is a form of periodization, but there's way more advanced approaches to that. But basically, it's just planning your training to get you where you want to go.
Gotcha. Okay, so. And I know there's various ways to periodize a training program, right? And the thing is that in my opinion, a lot of those ways are more focused on strength than they are actual hypertrophy. So can you kind of talk about what the traditional periodization model looks like, why it's probably not optimal, and how you would change it if the goal is to build muscle and not just strength?
Yeah, absolutely. So periodization, basically, it's like a Soviet concept. Originally, it came about a guy called Leo Matveev, who was a Russian sports physiologist, sports scientist, came up with a concept to help the Russian athletes perform well at Olympics. That's where it originates from. And they used a linear model, which means you start with high volumes and low intensities, and then over time, that changes, so you finish up with low volumes and really high intensities. So that's the linear progression. So doing sets of, like to shorten this out, doing sets of 12 at the start and gradually transitioning down to hitting singles, for example, would be a linear progression. It's geared for sports where power is the key element, or displaying strength primarily. So it works great for a power lifter, for example, or a sprinter, or a thrower in the Olympic Games, like a shot putter. It works pretty well in that respect, because they just need to peak for one day and be as explosive as possible on that day. Now, in my opinion, it's not optimal for hypertrophy, because we know a few things about hypertrophy and training in general. Firstly, if you're training to be successful, it needs to be specific. So you need to train specifically to the adaptations that you want to create. Secondly, it needs to be progressive. And the problem with a linear model is that you start off with really high volumes and then you end up with low volumes. Now, all the research on hypertrophy shows that you need more and more volume over time to build muscle. So you're actually doing less and less volume. So you're doing the complete reverse of what you really need. So sure, you overload the body, but you overload via intensity. And intensity is percent of 1 rep max. So you might start out at 60% 1 rep max for sets of 15, and at the end you're doing 95% for a single. Now, whilst you are overloading on intensity, you're not overloading on a volume. And assuming you're above a threshold of intensity, which seems to be about 60–65%, then the most important determinant of your success with gaining muscle is the amount of volume you do. So essentially you want to do more.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you're saying the linear model in the traditional sense is basically great if you're maybe in a peak for a powerlifting meet or some kind of event where you need to be as strong as possible, but it's not optimal because we're not gradually increasing the total volume, which is one of the main variables that determines hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So now we know what not to do. What would you suggest for somebody who is trying to maximize muscle growth and wants to periodize their training program? What kind of a progression model or setup would you give them or advise them to follow?
Well, I actually, with most of my clients, I prefer a reverse linear. So basically you start off with lower volumes and higher intensities and transition to higher volumes and lower intensities. So it's the exact opposite. Now that works, in my experience, extremely well. So for example, they might set out doing sets of 6 to 8 in the first phase for most of their sets. And then they transition to the next block where they're doing mostly work in the 8 to 10 rep range, before then finishing off with a block in the 10 to 12 rep range, for example. And then they maybe take a maintenance phase. And if they want to keep going, they start over or go into a diet, depending on where they want to go. So I found that works really, really well. Now, an interesting thing is there's very few studies on this relating to hypertrophy. And actually, the study that is out there showed that linear works a little better. But that is pretty surprising. And Brad Schoenfeld speculated that reverse linear would be better, but was surprised by this study. The problem is it's one study. We need a whole, before we can confidently say anything based on the science, we need a whole lot more research. So what we can currently go on is like the overarching principles of training I talked about, like specificity, progressive overload, what we know about physiology and how the body adapts. And from that, we kind of have to plug that all into what makes logical sense. And with that in mind, the reverse linear is the way I see that working.
Gotcha. So just to clarify, when we do reverse linear periodization, are we doing one specific rep range / intensity for a whole block, focusing on that? Then the next block, we're maybe increasing the volume, decreasing the intensity, or is it happening throughout the same block?
So you can do both. Is the sort of answer. Is like the depends. It depends is the answer. But what I would tend to say is you bias your work. Say on average, just for the sake of argument, you kind of do 4-week blocks. It doesn't have to be 4 weeks, but just for this example, it works pretty well. You might bias your training in the first block, so most of it's around the 6 to 8 rep range, and there's some stuff outside it. And then in the next phase, you bias it towards the 8 to 10, and then the next phase, the 10 to 12. That could work great. Alternatively, you could use a daily undulating periodization scheme, but which ordinarily, or certainly in the most part, is they use a linear model. But you can still do that in a reverse linear approach. And it's one of the important things to consider is periodization schemes. They're not like just black and white. You can only use this one or this one. Actually, you can do a linear DUP, a reverse linear DUP. You can take the best of both and combine them. So my preferred option would be you're training a muscle group multiple times a week, say on average twice a week. And in day 1, you're slightly heavier, and day 2, you're slightly lighter. So in that first block, you might be hitting 6s for most of your sets. And then on the second day, you hit that muscle group, you're in the 8s. And then the next phase, you're hitting 8s on the first day and 10s on the second, and then you move into the third, and it's 10s or 12s. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep. So would you say that one might work better than the other for hypertrophy, or do you think that it's just preference?
Well, preference is key. So as good as a plan is, it's only as good as your ability to adhere to it and work hard with it. So your training program can be fantastic on paper, but if you're not really all into it, you don't enjoy it, you don't work hard with it, it's worthless. So it needs to be something that gets juices flowing, as it were. What you want to push hard, you want to work hard. So that's important. Adherence and is key factor in that aspect. But if I was to say, just based on, you know, I had a robot who just followed what the plan was, wasn't emotionally attached to anything, I prefer a reverse linear daily undulating periodization scheme, kind of like how I outlined, training muscle a couple of times a week, and the rep range just changes slightly throughout the week, but the general trend is a reverse linear trend.
Gotcha. And so, all right, so we know how we want to periodize our training, right? So we broke it down by intensity, rep range, things of that nature, but obviously we have to get better, we have to get stronger, we have to do more work. And that kind of happens naturally as we adjust those two variables. But I would assume that you also want someone to lift more weight throughout that block. How would you set up the progression for someone on a reverse linear periodization model?
Yeah, sure. Good point. So, well, number one, ideally, they can just keep through each, you know, if they're in 6 on bench press on Monday through the first phase, for example, hopefully they're just getting stronger week on that. And then in the second phase, they're doing 8. Now they'll use a little bit less weight, but they'll progress. And maybe by the end of that second block, they're using for 8 reps what they were using at the end of the first box for 6. So that can work. And that is obviously progression, and you get overload there with the amount of weight they're lifting and the amount of volume they're doing. That tends to work for guys who are kind of early intermediates really well. If you become more advanced, it's harder to do that because the scope for just adding reps with a given weight is much harder. You're closer to your ceiling. So then you have to get a little more creative. So things, for example, like back offsets can work to increase volume, and then you allow them to hit a top set, so they're still giving the body a stimulus. So another approach I sometimes use is they kind of hit they hit a 5 RM at the start of each session each week, or a 6 RM. Say it's a 6 RM. And they do that, and each week they aim just to find an extra little bit of weight, 2.5 kilos on the bar, like 5 pounds, whatever. That gives them your overload on weight. Also, psychologically, that's great because they're like, I'm getting stronger. And if you're getting stronger, good things are happening. But then they have back off sets where they maybe, so they're rather, they hit a heavy set of 5 or 6, and they back down and they're hitting multiple sets of 8, and I add a set each week. So whilst the weight may stay the same on those sets of 8, they're doing an extra set. Say they do 3 sets of 8 week 1, 4 sets week 2, 5 sets week 3. Even if the weight stays static, that's way more volume, and that is an overload and a marker of progression.
Gotcha. So, and that's mainly for, you know, more intermediate and then more advanced guys, obviously.
Yeah.
So let's take it back a notch and let's talk about the beginner, right? Because in the beginning, for most people, you're able to just slap more weight on the bar each session.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, is that if I tell this guy who's just new to training, hey, do 5 sets of 5 on the squat, do a full body workout for three times a week, it just might be too much work for him in the beginning, or maybe it won't. So my question is, if someone's a beginner, would a model where they're doing less sets for the same amount of reps, and then over the course of time just adding more sets until they get to a certain point, would that be ideal? Would it be a viable option? So say, for example, we start off with 3 sets of 5 on the squat, 3 sets of 5 on the bench, and so on and so forth. Then maybe next month we keep everything the same. Obviously, we want them to keep pushing more weight, but now we're doing 4 sets and then 5 sets. What do you think about that model?
Yeah, that could work great for people, beginner, probably for the first couple of years of training. That kind of approach has lots of merit to it. You know, you're very gradually increasing volume, which makes sense because whilst more is better, you got to think long term, and you want to kind of coax out your progress, because if you know the body needs overload. So if you do like all guns blazing straight in, you're doing 10 sets of something, that's kind of your benchmark for what provides an overload. And the only way to increase is to do 11 or 12 or 13 sets. Sooner or later, you run out of time to actually be able to create an overload stimulus. So getting the most from the least isn't a terrible idea, certainly in the early stages, because muscle growth is that much easier as you're a beginner. You should do less, and actually when you become more advanced, you have to do a lot more to keep growing. So I don't really have any problem with that plan you had outlined there at all. And just by adding weight to the bar, a beginner can keep doing 3 sets of 5 for quite a long time, and that adds up to a significant amount of volume. If they're doing that, say 3 times a week, and they're adding 2.5 kilos every session, well, that's a huge increase of volume. They don't need to add sets, but eventually they'll probably plateau, and then that's maybe when a time when, okay, a way to build volume isn't weight on the bar, it's an extra set.
Gotcha. And so just to stay on for the beginners for a little longer, we always hear about beginners and full body workouts 3 times a week. Like, that's the end all be all. If you're a beginner and you want to build muscle maximally, we do full body workouts 3 times a week. Now, I know that volume is a huge variable, right? Like, that's one of the main factors when it comes to building muscle. So what do you think about, because I get these emails all the time from guys who are naturally skinny, they want to build muscle, and everyone's telling them to do full body workouts, but it's just not really something they're interested in doing. On top of that, by the time they get to the middle of the workout, they've already done all these big, heavy compounds. They're absolutely taxed. And I can see that, right? Because I do full body workouts, and I've done them in the past. And especially as you get stronger, they get more and more taxing. So what if instead of doing 3 days, we did 4 days, we adjusted the volume accordingly, and instead of doing full body, maybe we did like a push-pull or focused on less muscle groups per day? Do you think that's a viable option for a beginner?
Yep, absolutely. I haven't got a problem with that at all. An upper-lower split would work as well, something like that. You could definitely get great progress out of that. And some of it, like the key things before we worry about what the science tells us, is, again, referring back to adherence. What fits their schedule, and what do they enjoy? So maybe they can get to the gym 4 days a week, but they can only spare 45 minutes of time. But so they're limited there. If they were trying to do whole body workouts, it just wouldn't work anyway, because if they've only got a 45-minute window they can be in the gym, they're not going to get that great workout. So things like that are really important, just the logistics of it, before you worry about what the science tells you. And individual preference is a big factor in that. And then upper lower would probably be my preferred option. A push-pull works great too. In terms of push-pull, are you thinking you basically like the back side of the body, essentially, so the hamstrings, glutes and back and biceps, and then as opposed to chest, shoulders, quads, and triceps?
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be like a push-pull legs, because then we're doing like 5 or 6 days, but it would be more of a push-pull full body. So we do all of our pushing one day, all of our pulling another day, and maybe this is a bit premature, but what do you think about a beginner focusing on breaking it down 2 days where it's heavier and then 2 days where it's lighter? Do you think that makes sense for them to do?
For an absolute beginner, I don't think they need to, because you'll grow off anything really at that point. Again, it comes, if they prefer that, they like getting a bit of a pump in one session and lifting heavier in the other, and they enjoy that, fantastic, yeah, go for it. If they're a bit more advanced, so they're transitioning from beginner to intermediate, then yes, I think it's a great idea. Just one point, again, talking about your split and how you organize things. When you're a very early beginner, you get really, really sore just from doing anything, right? You're not used to training, and anything gets you sore. It's all new, and you'll suffer from whatever session you do. And in that case, breaking the body up a little bit makes sense, because you allow, whilst one muscle group's sore, you can train another. So the idea of the push-pull or the upper-lower is one of the benefits there. And actually, interestingly, I'd say that maybe as an absolute beginner, that's a better option. And then you transition into, you might be able to do whole body, because you're not getting so sore now, and you can tolerate that. And then after a while, whole body, when you get strong enough, just isn't great, because it takes a long time to warm up for your sets, and you've got to warm up every muscle group, as opposed to doing some kind of body part split. So there's a lot of your session is spent warming up, so the session becomes really long. So then that's when you probably transition back to your push-pull or your upper-lower or your push-pull legs. Yes, I did. I'm not sure if I 100% answered your question, but it's
yeah, for sure. For sure. But the thing is, and the reason I ask is because I get a lot of guys who are obviously beginners and, you know, just do a full body 3 times a week. It's not sexy enough for them. They want something that's a little bit funner, a little bit more manageable. Some guys actually want to be in the gym more than 3 days a week, which I completely understand. I love
I'm the same.
Yeah. So okay. So just going back to having the heavy day and the lighter day, not necessary, as you mentioned, which I agree. But do you think that it's detrimental at all?
Absolutely not. No, I don't think it would be detrimental as long as the heavy and the light aren't too far apart, right? So we don't be training completely different strength qualities and rep ranges, because strength is a skill. And at this stage, they're learning that skill. So hitting triples and one day in sets of 15 and the other doesn't make sense, because they're just too far apart. And the efficiency they build up to do sets of 3 is very different to your 15s. And you're not training the same qualities. And so the body's, really simple terms, is kind of confused by what it's trying to adapt to. So bringing those brackets a bit more like I talked about when I was talking about that reverse linear DUP, where there's only a couple of reps different. So maybe they're hitting 6s and on Monday and 10s on Thursday. Something like that, I think, would work really well. They're close enough that you're staying in the same kind of range and the same strength quality, and they'll feed off each other. You know, you get better at the 6s with heavier weight, and that will lead on to being able to do more weight for your 10s, and then that 10s build your capacity to hit the 6s again.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. So, and you just touched on something, right? So we talked about the heavier load when you're doing maybe your 5 or 6 reps, you're getting stronger. And then with the 10 reps, you're kind of building your capacity. So just kind of going back to more intermediate and advanced guys, can you touch on the different, I guess, rep ranges and what the benefits are, you know, why we want to train heavy, why do we want to train in the quote unquote hypertrophy range, why do we even want to go light and go super high reps? What are the benefits and how do they work in terms of helping you build muscle?
Okay, cool. Sorry, you just cut out for a second. So just let me just confirm I know what you want, but you want to talk about the different rep ranges and why we would train in those different rep ranges. Okay. So if you look at a textbook, they basically break it down into your strength, which is like traditionally 1 to 5 rep range. And then the traditional hypertrophy range is 6 to 12. Maybe even some people would call 6 to 15. And then anything above that, you're working strength endurance. Now, at any one time, you probably want to be focusing in on a fairly targeted rep range so that your body adapts to that, rather than sending it a bunch of different signals and it's trying to adapt to all sorts of different things. And you're getting some adaptation, but not optimal adaptation to any one signal. What we want to do is optimize your results. So if you want to get big, most of your time should be spent in the 6 to 12 rep range. Not because it's magical in terms of hypertrophy. There are studies that show you can get the same hypertrophy from lower rep ranges and higher rep ranges if volume is matched. However, it's the most efficient way to get a lot of volume done. It has that nice balance of heavy load and you being able to do lots of sets and reps in that 6 to 12 rep range. So probably 3/4 of your time should be spent in the 6 to 12 rep range. But going above and below that range makes sense, and I think will actually maximize your hypertrophy because you explore all the avenues available for causing hypertrophy. Brad Schoenfeld's talking about mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Well, if you use all those rep ranges, you can hit all 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy.
Cool. Yeah, I guess it becomes kind of like a virtuous cycle when you're using all these rep ranges, because they all kind of help each other in a sense, right? The lower rep ranges are getting us stronger. The moderate rep ranges are kind of inducing hypertrophy and building that capacity. And then the higher rep ranges are increasing that, I guess, that lactate threshold so that we can work with all these other rep ranges for a longer period of time. And so I guess it kind of becomes this virtuous cycle of muscle gains.
Yeah, absolutely. And the point on that is that everything works, but it only works for so long. So, you can drop your volume down and hit some strength work to build your foundation, and off a bigger foundation you can build a bigger body, as it were. But then you need to get back to the high stuff that's really efficient at hypertrophy, that 6 to 12 rep range. Likewise, you can go high reps and really push lactic acid and metabolite accumulation, and that works great for a period of time. But then that starts to drop off. It's the law of repeated efforts or repeated bouts, and basically the response to a signal diminishes every time the body gets that signal again. So every time you're hitting, say, a metabolic workout, the adaptation is smaller and smaller and smaller until it tears off and it's really diminishing returns. Then you go back into a different style of training and work through that and milk that for the most you can get.
Cool. All right. So we touched on reps. Now, obviously, the next thing we want to talk about is sets. I know there's no perfect set amount of sets that we should be performing per muscle group, but there are some guidelines. Could you kind of go over those guidelines? So just imagine you're talking to someone who's asking you how they should set up their training program. What kind of advice would you give them in terms of figuring out how many sets they should be doing per muscle group, assuming that the goal is just overall muscle size?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, you're right. There's all sorts of variation between individuals and actually muscle groups. But if I was just to give blanket recommendations to start off with, and maybe we'll get into some specifics after. But you probably want to train a muscle group twice a week on average. You want to do 2 to 3 exercises for that muscle group, and you want to do 3 to 6 sets of each exercise. So say at the lower limit, that's 2 exercises for 3 sets twice a week. So that's 12 sets a week. Now for most people, that's probably like their threshold of, there'll be some good stuff there, but it's not maxing it out, right? And then on the other end is they could be doing 3 exercises for 6 sets twice a week. Now that's, not anyone can really recover from that. So the sweet spot is probably somewhere in the middle, and you might find that you have a main lift where you hit 5 sets twice a week. You have a smaller lift that you hit for 3 sets, and then an isolation lift which you hit for 2 to 3 sets, and you do that twice a week. And that's probably right around the sweet spot for them to build muscle. They do much more than that. They risk, on average, overtraining back, and then way less than that, and they're probably not really getting the most they could from their training.
Cool. So I guess another variable that maybe isn't as important, but maybe it's important for someone who is going to try to take this information and put together their own kind of training program. If you could you quickly touch on rest times and whether or not they're as important as we think, and maybe give us some guidelines?
Yeah, absolutely. So historically, when it comes to building muscle, we thought we need quite short rest periods, get a good pump, get the lactic acid going, and the research contradicts that. In as much as the key variable is the overall volume you do. That's more important than your rest period. So you shouldn't take rest periods so short that it brings your volume down. If you do, you're shooting yourself in the foot, and you're majoring in the minors. You're worrying about your rest period when actually you should be doing more work. So a good guideline is basically take as long rest between sets as you need to not you reduce the training volume, so you're ready to give a good effort in the next set. Some more practical guidelines: if you're for big lifts like your compound squat, bench, deadlift, probably 2 to 3 minutes. If you're doing reps in the 6 to 10 range, that would work quite well. For higher rep sets, you can bring the rest down a little bit because, contrary to what people might believe, rest is inversely related to repetitions. For isolation or machine-based stuff, you could probably keep it anywhere between 60 and 2 minutes for all sets, regardless of your rep range. And if you're hitting those heavy stuff, we talk about your heavy sets of 5 or less, then extend your rest periods out, because you need full recovery to get quality. So you might be taking 3 to 5 minutes in those lifts.
Awesome. So I think we pretty much covered everything that I wanted to cover. If you think there's anything we should add, please feel free. But with something that's a little bit more actionable, and I know you did this in our YouTube series, but if you could do it again just for the listeners of the podcast, Could you kind of just go over, just kind of lay out maybe the 3 training blocks, how you would adjust them, maybe start them off training this way, then the next cycle would look more like this, the third one would look like this. Just give them that template.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all. So if we're working on that reverse linear daily undulating periodization type thing, I'll talk that through. So phase 1, most of your sets in the 6 to 8 rep range, and you train the muscles twice a week. So probably, say for example, we do an upper lower split. So it's 4 days a week, or a push pull would work either way. Anyway, day 1 you hit a bit heavier, so the 6 rep range for most of your sets. Doesn't mean all sets in that session have to be 6, but the bulk of the work is there. And then the second time that week you revisit it, you do the most of the work in the 8 rep range. You gradually try and increase volume through that block. So you might add a set for each muscle group each week, for example. Then next, you take a deload, then go into the next phase. And same thing happens, but the reps are just increased slightly. You could stick with an upper-lower split, or you could go to push-pull legs. Actually, how I quite often have it is you do an upper, a lower, and then a push-pull leg. So it's 5 days a week. You do your heavy work in the first 2 sessions. Heavy in this phase is 8 reps, and then the higher rep stuff in the push-pull and the leg session that follow, and they're mostly 10 reps. So there you've lowered intensity but increased volume and frequency. And then you go into a final block, and assuming you've got plenty of time to train, we switch to a push-pull legs, and you hit each one twice a week. So it's 6 total sessions. So we've obviously increased frequency there. Now, volume, intensity, and frequency, they all kind of work together, and you can't push all 3 at the same time. One of them has to give. So here, what gives is that intensity. So we bring that down. We push the rep range up to 10s in the first time through, or maybe 10 to 12 on those first sessions. And then the second time through, you're hitting that push-pull legs rotation. Then that's when you can push that metabolite type work we briefly touched on earlier. So taking shorter rest periods, or doing higher reps, or trisets, giant sets, this sort of stuff, really chasing the pump. You could do something like that. Or in that phase, I mean, there's no perfect way, but another way is you do your upper lower, and you hit that through 6 times, and that actually means you hit each muscle 3 times in this phase, so frequency's even higher. And that, if you're doing that, you get the opportunity to have 3 different rep ranges through the phase. So day 1, 10s, day 2, 12 to 15, day 3 is a complete blast of trisets and giant sets, that kind of work.
Gotcha.
Okay, just quickly to jump in on that, I think the other thing then we haven't talked about, the only other thing is the importance of maintenance phases. It's quickly worth discussing if you have time for that. But it's one that I've definitely made some mistake in the past. You always want to be either getting bigger or getting leaner. And the idea of maintenance is this boring, horrible goal. But if you're a skinny guy that struggles to build muscle, you'll give that muscle up really easily. If you spend, say, 12, 16 weeks gaining and then transition straight to a cut, those final few pounds you built, you're probably going to kiss goodbye to. You need to allow the body to know it as its new normal, recognize it, and sort of you need to own that weight. So a maintenance phase is a great option to put in at the end of your hypertrophy work, and it's a low volume, strength focused block. It's a lot easier to retain muscle than it is to build it. So the amount of volume you have to do is lower. You just eat to maintain your weight. Do that for a month or so. That weight's now yours. You're confident you've got that, you own it, and then you transition into another mass gain phase if you want, or a cut.
Gotcha. Awesome. So we know the maintenance phase is about 4 weeks, and this is kind of just going to ensure that you hang on to the newly added muscle. You kind of just adapt, I guess, to that weight, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
But how long are we going to run each of the other phases, right? Because you said we're going to deload after each one. So I assume that we're not just going to run 4 weeks, back off, 4 weeks, back off. So how long, and then how do we know when it's time to back off? Yeah,
great question. Again, it depends. So the length of each phase depends, and that depends on you and your ability to recover from it. Now, as I talked about, you want to increase volume across it, and you're going to be trying to push load as well. You're going to try and find more weight. Now, for a while, you can do that, and you can add, if you add 1 set per body part to each session, you train it. A few weeks in, that's good, but you can't do that indefinitely. Sooner or later, you're going to run into a wall where you no longer recover. Now, you've had Mike Israel on, and he talks about max recoverable volume in his stuff. It's kind of that concept. Recovery is when you return to baseline. So a good rule of thumb is, say you're benching, everybody loves benching, right? So say you can hit 100 kilos for sets of 8, and you're doing that, and you're slightly increasing it, or you're in that ballpark, you're recovering, that's, you know, you're at your baseline. If 1 week you come in, you've been pushing volume, you go in, you try and hit it, and the first set's a grind for 5, you take a good rest, you go again, and you're like just barely going out 3 or 4 reps, you're not recovering, it's time for a deload. That's a really good sign. So when performance obviously drops off, now it could just be, you don't necessarily have to throw the baby out with the bathwater at that point. It might just be like you had a terrible night's sleep, work stress, you just had 1 bad session. So, you know, if that's happened, if you know that's the fact, okay, consider it, go and do your next session. Same thing happens again, chances are you're just not recovered and you need to back off. That's when you take a deload week and then transition to the next phase. So on that basis, each phase could last, you know, as long as a piece of string within reason. Usually we're talking between about 4 and 7 to 8 weeks is a phase. And that means you may not even get through all 3 phases of this, because if you hit 7 weeks, deload 7 weeks, you might be at the point where you're like, oh, you know what, I've built muscle, but I've gained a bit of fat. This is as fat as I want to get. Now it's time for my maintenance so I can cut. So then you wouldn't transition to that final phase. It's while it's set out and we have a framework, that framework needs to be adaptable based on you and your progress.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay, so the last thing that I want to ask you, and I think this will pretty much complete the whole puzzle, is what exactly does a deload week look like?
Okay, yeah, good question. So if you look at deload literature and a lot of stuff that people talk about there, it's based on strength athletes, a bit like a lot of the periodization models. So it's not necessarily completely applicable. So I tend to do things a little different, but in most strength stuff, you'll see they tend to deload on volume and keep intensity high. Now, so you're using the same weights you were the week before, but you just do a few less sets. So if you were doing 4 sets of 12, now you're doing 2 sets of 12, but you're still pushing as much as possible. I tend to drop intensity a little bit and bring volume down, because our goal is hypertrophy. We're not trying to, we're not so concerned about maintaining our top end strength. Whereas in the strength athlete, they're deloading so they can then get stronger. We're worried about building more muscle. So if you've got all the way through that phase to the final one, the 3rd one, for example, and you're doing your upper lower 6 days a week, your deload, the sessions, you cut the overall volume in half. So you do 50% of the sets. And then you probably bring the weights down to about 80% of the weight you were using. So you get in, you still get the technique work and keep, you're close enough to your working weights that you're not losing that skill, but those sessions feel super easy. A rule of thumb with the deload is it should be easy. You should feel like you should be itching to get in it. Halfway through, you should be like keen to go, ready to go. I feel great. But you just got to be patient, give yourself that whole week and then smash it the next week. If you feel like you're getting a training effect in a deload week, it's not a deload. And this isn't like, so people sometimes are like, oh, so I'm deloading on weights, I'll do a bunch of cardio. No, your body systemically needs the chance to recover. So yeah, drop the weights by about 10%, 20% in that range, and cut volume in half.
Now, would it be a viable option to cut the intensity in half and leave the volume, something like that?
You could do that, but I would not suggest that that's the best way, because the weights are really, really light, which means you're not getting that much of a training stimulus. So you're not retaining the skill element, but you're keeping volume high. I mean, it's still low, right? Because even if you're doing the same sets and reps at 50%, that's half the volume. So you cut volume that way down. We're not retaining the skill. So what I would suggest is going the other way and keeping the load, pretty heavy. So you're in the ballpark, but it's not challenging. None of your sets should be anywhere near failure. You should be leaving plenty of reps in reserve, but you're staying in touch with your training weights so that you don't lose that skill, but the volume's cut so that you are in and out of the gym quickly, In fact, you can actually go in fewer days per week on a deload. So because the volume is so short, you could probably condense 6 days worth of training into 4, for example. Gives you that bit more time, just to relax. And that I like actually as an option, because that means you get extra complete rest days in the week. And having a day when you don't even go in the gym, you just chill out, it's Netflix and chill, something like that, completely relaxed, is great for overall recovery.
Gotcha. So just to be clear, what you're suggesting is decrease the weight slightly.
Yeah, like 15-20% is probably a good place.
And then chop the volume in half. So if we're doing 4 sets this week, we're doing 2 sets.
Yeah, and you might even, I mean, like with any of this, it's a spectrum. There's no exact. It's like there's that continuum of grey between the black and the white. You might choose, just to throw some numbers out, say you're hitting 4 sets of 12 on squats for 100 kilos. You might go, I'm going to drop that 15%. So 85 kilos, I'm going to do 2 sets of 10. So you're close enough to the weight and the reps that it's keeping you in touch with, like I talked about, that skill, and that strength quality that you've developed. But the volume's so low that you recover really easy from that. And it's amazing how easy those sets feel when you're leaving, 4 or 5 reps in the tank, and you're only doing a couple of sets rather than the 4 or 5 sets you're used to do.
Very cool, man. Well, I think that about wraps it up. So before we hop off, because I know guys are going to be asking, where can they connect with you? Where can they read more of your stuff? Maybe watch videos, your podcast. I'm not sure if that's up and running yet, but could you kind of just give and I'm going to link all of this stuff in the description, so they'll be able to go in there and click it. But just for the sake of the listeners, could you just tell them where they could go to see more from Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks. The best place is just to hit my website, is flatwhitesfreeweights.com. You go on there, and at the top there's a tab for Facebook or YouTube and Instagram. If you're more into watching videos, obviously choose the YouTube one. What I can tell you is my Instagram is less there's less informative stuff. If you want to learn more about training, get on my Facebook or my YouTube. There's plenty of content there, and there's a blog on the website where I have a bunch of articles, and obviously I've written articles for guys like yourself, so you can find stuff there, breaking muscle, that sort of place. But most of it, hit my website, go from there. It has everything you need.
Very cool, man. Well, thanks again for taking your time, and we went well over the allotted 30 minutes.
Sorry about that.
A lot of great information. No, I mean, I kept you here, and this is great. A lot of good information. Guys are really going to find some serious value in this. And yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. I hope it was helpful. And yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to let me know, and I'll try and help out.